Good afternoon, and thank you for your gracious introduction. So, I'm Dee Jordan, and I'm looking forward to a rich and authentic discussion with my esteemed panelists. First, we have Dr. Robert Bullard. He is a distinguished professor of urban planning and environmental policy and director of the Bullard Center for Climate and Environmental Justice at Texas Southern University. He is the father of environmental justice and this year's recipient of the AGS John Gould Medal. Next, we have Dr. Orville Grey. He's a coastal ecologist, a coastal ecologist and climate change researcher. He is the head of Secretariat for the National Adaptation Plan Global Network, which is hosted by the International Institute for Sustainable Development. And finally, we have Mr. Ryan Hathaway. He is the Director of Environmental Justice and Director of the White House Environmental Justice Interagency Council at the White House Council on Environmental Quality in the Executive Office of the President. Gentlemen, welcome to GO 2050. Our panel discussion will proceed as follows. I will post an image or video and provide a brief overview. Then I will ask each of you to offer 2-minute remarks discussing the image from the perspectives of justice, equity, and risk. Each of you will have also provided us with an image of your own, which you will discuss the risk implications, equity, and justice perspectives for that image. Does that sound fair? Is that what we all agreed on? Great. So I'm going to click through a few things here, as I should have showed you their wonderful portraits as they ascended the stage, but I don't always move according to plan, and this doesn't either, huh? Assistance. There we go. Oh, wow. We're going kind of fast here. Hold on. So, assistance. Hey, I need assistance. The clicker isn't clicking.
Can you see this?
Okay. Well, while we wait for that little technical interlude, we'll entertain you with some musings about AGS. But where? Where do I point? I know I did. It didn't do it. Where? See?
Don't aim it that way. It's back here.
Jesus. Okay, now. Okay, look. Don't go. You see I'm pushing? Hello, sir? Look. So, AGS is happy to have you all here with us this afternoon to celebrate our 9th or 10th, depending on how you look at it, GO 2050. It's so wonderful to see a room full of people eager to learn about risk, hazards, and all the myriad of ways this is visualized across the landscapes we all live and inhabit. And hopefully, through these conversations and engagements, we can find some solutions to some really terrible problems. So how about that for you all? Okay. Look at us. Maybe we're in business, guys. We're trying. Or you can just give me a keyboard or...
Batteries.
Oh, no, here it is. You got to press the front. You're pressing the back.
Yeah, but I don't want these to be seen yet.
No, the computer's back here.
Okay. So this is the first image. Okay, well, we're going to move on, guys. How about that? We're just going to move right along. These things happen when you're in live prime time. This is what we get. So anyways, gentlemen. As I would like to tell you in the audience, as I'm sure we can all agree, risk is not simply a series of environmental events, but rather the cumulative effects of social, ecological, environmental, and political phenomena. So with that in mind, we will look at some images representing these dimensions. And since this is Geography 2050, why not take a survey of these types of risk around the world? We'll start here, as you can see, with an image of Hurricane Katrina, which decimated parts of the Deep South region of the United States, including New Orleans, Louisiana. Can you characterize the risk landscape from this image? What vulnerabilities are present? And is it possible that justice and equity could correct these vulnerabilities? And we'll start with Dr. Bullard.
Thank you. First of all, good afternoon. In looking at this image, I went on sabbatical August of 2005. And no, I was supposed to go on sabbatical of September 2005, and actually had to go on sabbatical in August when Katrina hit. So I had a whole year to work on Katrina. And I had been working in New Orleans for decades before this, and had written about vulnerabilities in the Gulf Coast, particularly in communities in the South and Gulf Coast communities. The risks associated with Katrina were, in terms of the disaster, they were all human-made. The vulnerability was human-made in terms of where people live, the extent to which levees, the built environment provided protection or not. And if you look at the damage that was caused in the communities of greatest risk were the same communities that historically had been denied infrastructure, or racially segregated, or racial redlining, not having the strength of the build-out of levee protection based on equity and fairness. So when you talk about the breach of the levees that created the filling up of New Orleans, which is a bowl, the storm didn't hit New Orleans, in terms of the hurricane. It was the levee breach that created the problem. If you map where the vulnerability, the historic nature of segregation and the history of lack of infrastructure, et cetera, it's the same neighborhoods that got hit the hardest. I wrote a book on that. 2009, it's called Race, Place, and Environmental Justice After Hurricane Katrina, Struggles to Reclaim, Rebuild, and Revitalize New Orleans. And some of the previous books that I wrote actually dealt with the same vulnerability, but absent of this disaster, this human-made disaster. God didn't do it. The levees were not strong enough to hold out the waters.
Dr. Orville?
Thank you, Dee. Thanks, everyone, for having me here. I'm happy to be here among this esteemed audience. For me, I'm Jamaican. So the whole context of what happened with Katrina in Louisiana, I witnessed all of that from my television screen or my laptop screen. And, with my little understanding of, the context in the United States, one of the things that struck me in terms of the magnitude of the impact was that as Dr. Bullard mentioned, those that were most impacted were the most vulnerable. They were the minorities. They were in areas that would have been of lesser value and with the least protection. And, from a climate justice perspective, one of the things that spoke to me was the after Katrina effects. What was going to happen? And, seeing news reports years after coming out where a lot of persons that lived in these areas were no longer being able to go back into these areas because they were now being rehabilitated, and the value, strangely enough, went up. And it's a different profile. So, it begs a question as to persons in this area, what can they look forward to in terms of, improving their standards so that they are more resilient and are able to occupy a space that they once owned and be able to feel comfortable in that space. And one of the big things, especially from the risk perspective, that stood out was that the insurance sector was, for the most part, very much prepared for all of this. They're always prepared. They have the numbers. Yeah. And, so you could almost see what was going to come, hoping it was not coming, but then it played out almost as expected, almost like a script.
Yeah, that's quite interesting. Mr. Hathaway.
Yeah, thank you, first off, to AGS, to you, and to Columbia University for hosting us. It is a painful image. It's a hard image to see. I mean, my immediate response is my heart and stomach and chest just go straight back to the lower Ninth Ward in New Orleans. I think about times in my childhood. My mom's from Shreveport. I spent a lot of time in New Orleans growing up and still to this day. And it's not the same city that it was before Katrina. I'll say I've been in the federal government now for almost 15 years. There are entire courses and things that we teach and learn to this day from Hurricane Katrina about how to consider, how to prepare on the front end, how to build mitigation and resilience and adaptability into the communities that have been underinvested in. I think one of the things I'm really excited about is some of the investments that are coming out right now in the bipartisan infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act we're seeing historic, hundreds of billions of dollars going into infrastructure, and at the same time, expectations that equity is at the front and center, that thinking about communities that have been marginalized, that have been overburdened by pollution, that have been underinvested in historically, should be at the front end of the line to receive the benefits of those investments. And I think taking Katrina into the context of one of the worst disasters of my childhood, I remember exactly where I was in August watching this on the news and calling my mom and calling our friends in New Orleans and just feeling totally unprepared. And, I think it's a sad feeling to know that that is the case for many people in many events around the country and the world when it comes to climate change, just not feeling prepared, even when you thought you were, not feeling like what is going to happen with your loved ones. And I think it's an opportunity for us to continue to learn and to grow in the federal government, but also how do we work and engage with our partners in state government and local government and community organizations? How do we really take to heart, I'm the Director of Environmental Justice, so the definition now that exists from Executive Order 14096, meaningful engagement and just treatment. Well, how do we meaningfully engage communities in and around climate change, in and around adaptability ahead of time so that we know how resilience for one community might look different for a different community. Adaptability, these are global problems with local solutions. And so focusing on what the communities are saying to us and letting them inform our decision-making, letting them inform our disaster response, our preparedness, is gonna make us more successful as a federal government.
Thank you all for your very poignant remarks. So now we are going to zone all the way out to the global scale. We're going to try this again here. That's right. Clap it up for your girl. Thanks. So we're going to talk about COVID-19 vaccine equity. As of August 2023, countless people worldwide have yet to receive the first dose of COVID-19. Similarly, many have yet to be fully vaccinated worldwide. Can each of you discuss how inequity might exacerbate global risk for a re-emergence of a variant of COVID-19? And we'll start with Dr. Orville.
Thanks, Dee. When you put up a map like that, one of the first things that speak to me is, the countries that are highlighted are countries in a region that inequality is stamped right across it. You know, these are countries that, from an economic perspective, they don't necessarily have the resources to be able to handle these pandemics. And I think the fact that many of these countries are not, you know, well defined by air routes is one of the reasons why they weren't as impacted as many other regions. I remember when the pandemic started, I was in South Korea at the time. And, you know, there were quite a number of news stories that came out that countries in Africa may actually survive the best because to some extent they're isolated. The only region that stood out higher was the South Pacific Islands. The idea that, you know, these are people that could face a similar challenge in the future is very high. You know, when you look at, for instance, and, you know, I'm coming from the climate change background, and looking at the challenges that we are seeing from a changing climate, there is every likelihood that there could be an impact, and one that potentially could create the space for a new variant of COVID-19 that could impact countries in Africa in a very significant way. Similarly, you know, the Pacific Islands or even Latin America and the Caribbean. These are areas where even the coming together as groups and trying to access vaccine was a difficulty. You had countries in Africa under their African banner coming together and you know, trying to negotiate with countries like United States, the European Union, India, to try to access vaccine. You had other countries that, because they were so far down on the list, they went to China to access vaccine. And even once they had put the resources in place and were ready to receive, they had a difficulty in having the vaccine transported to their countries. And then the logistics inside the countries to get that out. Most of the rural communities never saw anything remotely close to a needle with a vaccine. And the likelihood is that this is going to continue. These are going to be the most vulnerable people. You talk about it from a geographic perspective. The remote locations in countries in Africa, for instance, and even in other regions, they're the last to receive support regardless of the challenges. You only have to look at, for instance, some of the earthquakes that we have seen in recent times to understand. So the inequality will persist until we get to a state where developed countries and developing countries are playing from the same field. And the chance, and you know, looking at the landscape now, the likelihood of that happening is less. But within this room and within the, you know, the amount of brain matter that we have right here and the resources that we have at our hands, we're in a very unique position to be able to offer support, open up pathways to reduce some of these inequalities, to support many of these countries and peoples that have been under significant stress.
Thank you. Mr. Hathaway.
Thank you. I'll say we're in a room of geographers, right? So I imagine that all of you could see the reality, whereas this is a very zoomed out picture of the world. If you zoom into any one of those countries, I bet you'll see a similar map playing out in a similar way, right? We have access to this information. This is something that's happened since I was a kid. Being able to see these realities in real time, or at least closely after in real time, gives us the ability to do something with this information, to coordinate with each other. I think within the United States, this is a lesson that I know our friends at HHS and CDC are looking at on a daily basis. We have tools, we have maps that give us the ability to see these inequities. And so then the challenge is how do we grow past it? How do we coordinate with each other to address these? Because you know, we talk a lot about cumulative effects in the environmental justice world. There's a reason why it is also called out in the executive order that was passed this past year. These are cumulative effects in the making. You know, these are inequities that will build up over time. If you have communities that aren't receiving equitable treatment, that aren't receiving equitable access to health care, that's something that is going to cost them as they go into the future. And it's something that's, quite frankly, going to cost the rest of the world and the communities that are around them as you go into the future. We talk about Hurricane Katrina, it's $125 billion to date in efforts to recover that. And you wonder how much we could have saved from a human cost, most importantly, but also from a cost overall, had we addressed and prepared and built resilience and addressed some of the inequities that we know to exist on the ground at the time.
Yeah. And Dr. Bullard, I'm going to switch the question a little bit for you as a person who has given his life to work in equity and justice. So universal health care has been built as, you know, this like great savior of humanity. If we just all had universal health care, it evens the playing field, everything is fine. Do you think that universal health care would have resolved this issue of inequity?
Well, thank you for that different question. Let me just try to answer that by saying, I think what we need is a great transformative move to harmonize the concept of access to health care to be universal. We don't have that. What we have today is cascading multiple threats that are converging at the same time. Mm-hmm. Now, this map that you have up here deals with COVID and the risk, but as you peel away, and these geographers can do this, peel away those underlying conditions that make the COVID pandemic worse, mm-hmm. as opposed to, you know, you're seeing where the poverty, lack of transportation, lack of access to health insurance, food and water insecurity, the levels of environmental degradation. You start naming all those things and you can map all of that. So if even when you deal with the pandemic and get people shots, those underlying conditions are still making quality of life and the misery index much more acute for those populations that have been left out and left behind in economies that have been able to take advantage of, and in many cases have been very extractive and have gotten wealthy, whereas the host countries have remained in a condition that make them much more susceptible and as we look at the climate risks overlaying this and those other vulnerabilities, the climate change will exacerbate those global disparities, inequities at scale, which we all can kind of imagine, make them much worse.
Yes.
So it means that when we talk about climate change, addressing climate solutions also means addressing health care inequities, addressing environmental degradation inequities and access to food and water, all those things, as opposed to climate change dealing with greenhouse gases and parts per billion.
Yeah. Thank you all for your responses to that question. I'm greatly appreciative of just your thoughtfulness and the meaningfulness and the eloquence of each of your responses. Thank you, and I hope you all are enjoying this panel as much as I am. So now, we're gonna watch a short video, and I wanna just provide a little trigger warning for the audience. The images can be triggering. So I wanna let you know now, but it's about the real-time impacts of climate change at Lake Ngami. the dying lake in Botswana, and this is happening in real time. The video is completely silent in order to allow the imagery to wash over you. So if you feel a little squeamish, we won't be offended if you walk out. Gentlemen, you'll have 1 minute to remark to this particular video because the video is about 3 minutes. Okay. Do I need to? How do I make it play? Voila. Okay, gentlemen, so seeing in this film the real-time effects of desertification in Botswana, but not just exclusive to Botswana. There are many other countries in sub-Saharan Africa, in the Caribbean, and other tropics, in other tropical countries, where their livelihoods are being carved out on the land, by the land, through the land. The animals are expecting to go to a lake where there is water available. They have learned this. They have yet to unlearn that water no longer exists here, leaving the pastoralists, the smallholder farmers, and the fishermen to figure out new ways to extract a living from a lake that's dried because of the impacts of climate change. What here are the implications for the rest of the world? What can we here in the global north think about? How do we counteract the impacts of what's inevitable, climate change? And how can justice seemingly upright what looks to me as a disastrous circumstance? And we will start with Mr. Hathaway. Remember, your remarks are 1 minute.
1 minute, okay. I'll keep it short, and I'll say it's hard to see images like that. It's hard to see them of any life, human, animal, other, and I'll say there are challenges similar to what we're seeing in sub-Saharan Africa play out all over the world. You saw the wildfires in Australia, you see wildfires in the United States, you see drought, and I'll try to end my minute with something positive here, and again, leaning on some of the historic investments we see. Bipartisan infrastructure law, $100 million going towards drought resilience out west. We have removed hazardous wildfire fuels from 8.4 million acres across the United States, and these investments are going to continue to go out. And what I will say is we now have an opportunity here in our country, in this group, and all of you out there, especially the students out there who are going to be stepping into the future leadership roles for our country, for the United States, to be the leader in this space, to set the stage for the rest of the world, to try to do the right thing so that others are willing to follow what we are doing. We're not going to address these problems overnight, and we're certainly not going to address them by ourselves.
Great, yes. Dr. Bullard.
Yes, I saw the fingerprints of those who have contributed least to the problem of climate change and the negative impacts being hit first, worst, and longest. The people and the animals and the economic or the economies that they're dependent upon in terms of food, water, etc. I also see the implications of policy as it relates to the global scale at the COP, this last COP, that climate meeting that was in Egypt, where the first time there was an environmental climate justice pavilion on the government side, the Blue Zone, that advocated that. I was one of the 3 organizations that helped sponsor that pavilion. First time climate justice was ever on the government side. Bullard Center, Deep South Center in New Orleans, and WEAC in New York sponsored that pavilion. And we brought organizations, NGOs, community groups, leaders from all over the world in solidarity with the Global South advocating for loss and damage. If there's not a case for funds to assist a country as it relates to loss and damage, a country that has contributed least to the problem but has feeling the impact of climate change. The United States, for the first time, signed on to agreeing to this fund, this international fund for loss and damage. And that was in Sharm el-Sheikh at COP27. COP28, which will be in Dubai, kicking off November 30th through the 12th of December is when they're supposed to implement. Now, there's words and there's deeds. The rich countries have not lived up to their words. And we hope that we will have enough push and collective action globally, as well as domestic here in the U.S., to get the rich countries to pay into this fund that can assist countries that are feeling, poor countries, developing countries, low, moderate income countries to mitigate and address some of the inequities resulting from global warming and climate change. Having the science is not enough. We've got lots of information, lots of data, lots of reports from the UN, but having the data is not enough. We have to marry that science, facts, data with action, and action now.
Thanks,
Gray.
thanks, Dee. And I'll pick up from two gentlemen. The images are stark. They're graphic, you know, they grab hold of you. But one of the things that image said to me was that I could readily see the implants of overlaying that with a similar human tragedy.
Yeah.
I mean, I don't know how many of you have experienced this, but I know what it's like to have to walk miles to get water during a period of drought when there's no water in the pipe. It's not much different from that. I've seen images, for instance, even after Katrina, with people lined up for miles to access water.
Yeah.
As geographers, we can map where water is located. We know where the resources are. As policy experts, we know how to pull together policies to provide the policy and institutional resilience that's required to build the resilience in communities and people. We're not short of that. We do have the funds. The challenge for us is recognizing that there is more than an urgent need to bring the funds forward to support the most vulnerable. We've had a promise from 2010 at the Cancun COP for $100 billion per year by 2020, and we have failed to live up to that promise.
You're here.
As I've told many of my colleagues from developing countries, we may be the most vulnerable, but we're not the only ones that are vulnerable. People from the north are, if not as vulnerable, are going to be as vulnerable in the years to come. So this inequality, it's going to spread, it's going to grow, unfortunately. But we have the resources now to do something about it. We're talking about something that is potentially an existential threat. But if we avoid the buzzwords and the scare words, we just have to reflect that we actually do have the resources to help countries to put together their national adaptation plans and other plans to build resilience in their systems, in their people. We do have the resources to bring together, so many of us in the audience here, to help countries to, pull together the disaster risk reduction plans, the adaptation to climate change plans, and put the resources behind it to implement in the field at the local level to avoid the conversation that's going to come up after this session where you're talking about loss and damage and, and that big window. There's a lot that we can do. The footprints are real, and I'm sure we can identify that, by just looking in our own backgrounds.
Thank you once again. So in the interest of time, the last two images I was going to show on the refugee crisis and the wealth gap in the U.S., I will not show you those images, but I would like for you to think about them as you give your closing remarks after I show your images, okay? Okay, Dr. Orville.
Thanks, Dee. So this is my image. How many of you here drink coffee? Let me see the hands. Almost everyone.
No.
All right. So this is my Blue Mountain coffee, Jamaica Blue Mountain coffee, one of the most expensive. It's only grown, at a certain altitude in the Blue Mountains. The challenge for me here is that the persons who grow coffee are among the most vulnerable. They're, small farmers trying to eke out a living. Their return on this investment is very small compared to the Starbucks and other franchises. With climate change, when I go back home, Jamaica, the average temperature, we used to say 96 degrees in the shade. That's now a blessing when it happens. It's really hot.
Yeah.
The area for growing this coffee with climate change, there's now a progression up the mountain. So this means not only either a shrinking space to grow, a shrinking income for a vulnerable group of people, a shrinking income for a national cultural asset on a national scale, but also, a shrinking of just things that we can enjoy. That is what climate change is doing at a level that many of us do not see. Spatially, we can map where they grow. We can also use the forecast and the scenarios to map where they will likely be able to grow in the future. This is a situation where we are now trying to put efforts behind it to build the necessary resilience in the people and the systems to be able to continue to support this economy. This is just a fragment of what it's like in a small island developing state, trying to adjust to a changing climate while providing for the people in the country. Thank you.
Thank you. Next one. All right, so thank you for that, Dr. Orville. Dr. Bullard, and the famous line that I use all the time, the wrong complexion for protection.
Okay, the title says it all. Race, America is segregated and so is pollution. The impacts of climate change fall disproportionately on low-income and people of color communities. And a lot of that has to do with historic segregation, structural racism in terms of infrastructure, and the extent to which some communities are devalued. And this is an example of the fact that if you map out where communities that historically have been denied basic infrastructure and have been the subject of industrial pollution, refineries, petrochemical, oil and gas, fossil fuel communities, these are the same communities that face the greatest impacts and the least amount of resilience and have not experienced an economic renaissance across the fence, but others have benefited. And this is Cesar Chavez High School, which is located across from one of the largest refineries in the country. And this is a neighborhood in Corpus Christi. Yeah. It's either Corpus or Houston. They're basically the same across fence line communities. Yeah. The question is, will the government response to climate change be fair? And it took 300 pages for us to write this book. But the short answer is hell no. But the idea, unless we force it to do that, and we have mechanisms to force that to come to fruition in the form of the Inflation Reduction Act, the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, and Justice 40 overlaid to say 40% of the benefits should go to those communities that historically have been left out and left behind. The money, and they should be getting in front of the line when it comes to climate solutions and not false solutions like carbon capture storage or hydrogen hubs. They're talking about putting a hydrogen hub in the same place where that school across the fence or the same community that's there. Those are false solutions we should resist because there's no science, there's no facts, there's no data. And so we're saying we want this to be real and use the resources that are in the federal government to force that to happen.
Thank you for that. All right, and lastly, Mr. Hathaway.
Sure, I'll try to close us out on a positive note, and I have to call out one of my fellow panelists who is celebrating quite a historic moment up there.
Got excited.
So this is a picture from the signing of Executive Order 14096, and Dr. Bullard hit and set me up for a lot of the things that I want to say, which is we right now are at a place with historic opportunities and investments, and there are challenges in making sure they go out equitably, to making sure that we implement Justice 40. Justice 40 is an initiative that was signed into law in the first week of this administration. It says that 40% of the benefits of certain investments are to go to the historically underinvested in, historically overburdened by pollution communities that are identified in the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool that the Council on Environmental Quality, along with many of our federal partners, have helped build. It is a historic opportunity now. If you look at bipartisan infrastructure law to date, and this is an old to date, $400 billion in investments across the country, 40,000 projects across communities in every state, across tribes, across territories in this country. And there is both a challenge in getting it out equitably, but also an opportunity to do this right, to show the rest of the country, to show the rest of the world, to show our partners that if you use tools like the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool, the fact of the matter is it gives us the ability to identify where we need to engage with communities, to identify where our investments need to go. And we saw a lot of global maps and images on here, but I will tell you, you do not have to go far to find inequity in our country. And in fact, if you go on, I was on right before we came onto the Climate and Economic Justice Screening Tool. Geographers, which way is north right now? Someone point me north. Now everyone's pointing us. So about 3 to 4 blocks that way, there's a census tract that is in the 98th percentile for proximity to hazardous waste, and the 93rd percentile for proximity to Superfund sites, and the 91st percentile for asthma, and 76th percentile for being low income, 91st percentile for housing cost. You know, these are facts and indicators that our federal government now have access to in the pocket, in the phone that is in their pocket as they are making decisions on these funds. And we have set the expectation that 40% of the benefits of the funds within our Justice 40 programs that span bipartisan infrastructure law, Inflation Reduction Act, as well as over 450 programs across the federal government that include ones that have been around for 30, 15, 10 years, are going to go to disadvantaged communities, communities that need the help of these investments to build resilience, to build in mitigation measures, and to build in their chance to have breathable air and clean water to drink, and to make sure that we don't have lead pipes in the United States anymore in the future, that everyone has breathable air and clean water and access to the outdoors and a clean environment for which your kids to grow up in. And, you know, I would love to be a part of the generation that when my grandkids get old, they look and they don't think about the burdens that were passed on to them. They think about the things that were accomplished to set them up for their future.
Absolutely.
You're here.
Absolutely. What a fantastic way to end this panel. Audience, please join me in thanking our illustrious panel. They were fantastic, fantastic. And I just want to say the 5th National Climate Assessment was released just within the week, Dr. Bullard. Please take a moment to look at it. Dr. Bullard is an aficionado when it comes to those documents. Please feel free to reach out to him or connect with him while he's here and ask about the 5th National Climate Assessment. Thank you again.
Thank you, Dee.
Thank you, Dee, Robert, Ryan, and Orville for that very thoughtful discussion.